The Colosseum trembled with excitement, a monstrous amphitheater carved from the bones of long-dead titans. The crowd, a chaotic sea of alien species, buzzed with anticipation, their voices merging into a thunderous roar. Today was a special day. A new fighter was entering the pit. Not just any fighter. A human. The announcer's voice, a guttural growl amplified by speakers mounted around the Colosseum, rang out. Behold, warriors of Viekaris Prime. Feast your eyes on the newest challenger, a creature from the distant blue world of Earth. A moment of silence. Then, laughter. The stadium erupted in mocking howls, chittering, screeches, and hissing tones as thousands of alien spectators jeered at the announcement. A human? Here? The gladiatorial pits of Viekaris Prime were infamous across the galaxy. No warrior entered unless they were bred for war, honed by years of bloodshed, or created through genetic perfection. The fighters who stepped into this pit were monsters, champions of their species. And today's entertainment was a weak, soft-skinned human. The massive gates of the Colosseum rumbled open. From the shadowy entrance, he stepped forward. The human stood alone in the center of the pit. He was unarmed. He had no armor, save for a sleeveless combat vest over his torso and a pair of worn cargo pants. His boots were scuffed, his knuckles scarred, but compared to the behemoths that fought in this arena, he looked pitifully weak. No cybernetic enhancements. No glowing energy fields. Not even the brutish muscle mass that many gladiators prided themselves on. He looked normal. And that, more than anything, made the crowd laugh even harder. This is the challenger, bellowed a massive, six-armed warlord from the audience, his voice booming like a drum. His kind, the Kroveks, were known for their brutal pit champions. He's smaller than my hatchlings. This is an insult. A group of Zorkan warriors, their hulking reptilian forms glistening under the artificial sun, hissed in agreement. Their champion, Gorvak the Executioner, stood at the far end of the pit, arms crossed, an unimpressed sneer on his monstrous face. Gorvak was a living nightmare. Standing at nearly 12 feet tall, his body was covered in thick, armored scales, a natural defense stronger than most battle armor. He had 6 powerful arms, each wielding a different weapon, 2 plasma axes, 2 serrated war blades, and a massive energy flail wrapped around his upper arm like a coiled serpent. His face was a twisted mass of scars, trophies of past victories, his yellow eyes burning with bloodlust. He had slaughtered hundreds in this arena. This human was just another name to add to the list. The announcer's voice rang out again. Facing him today, the reigning champion of Viekaris Prime. The butcher of 12 systems. The undefeated master of the killing arts, Gorvak the Executioner. The stadium shook from the force of the applause. Gorvak raised 2 of his weapons in acknowledgement, his lip curling in disgust as he eyed his pathetic opponent. The human didn't flinch. He didn't react at all. Gorvak took a step forward, his massive clawed feet making deep imprints in the sand. His voice, guttural and filled with contempt, carried across the arena. This is a joke. The human still said nothing. Gorvak narrowed his eyes. You understand what's happening here, meat sack? This is not a fight. This is a slaughter. I will break you. I will peel the skin from your bones and feed it to the crowd. Still, the human did not speak. The silence was almost unsettling. Gorvak expected defiance. He expected begging. Maybe even some trembling. That's how most weaklings reacted before their deaths. But this human? He just stood there. Calm. Silent. Unmoved. Something about it irritated Gorvak. His grip on his weapons tightened. Nothing to say? The human finally moved. Not a step forward. Not an aggressive motion. Just a slow roll of his shoulders, cracking his neck from side to side. His eyes, cold and emotionless, locked onto Gorvak's. Then, in a low voice, he spoke. Get ready. Gorvak bared his fangs. For what? The human's lips curled into a small, almost mocking smile. For war. The crowd exploded in laughter once more. But something about the way he said it? Something about his calm certainty. It felt wrong. Gorvak shook off the unease. It didn't matter. The weak always acted tough before they were torn apart. He'd make this quick. He'd make this brutal. And he'd make sure the human never spoke again. The announcer raised his hand. The arena fell into an anticipatory hush. The drums of war began to sound, echoing through the ancient pit. Then, with a booming voice, the announcer bellowed. Begin. The gong smashed through the silence, signaling the start of the fight. Gorvak lunged forward, his 6 arms moving in perfect coordination, his axes and blades swinging in a storm of death. He was too fast for something so big. No warrior had ever dodged his first attack. No one had ever survived a direct hit. And yet, the human was gone. Not dead. Not cut in half. Just gone. Gorvak's axes sliced through empty air. His eyes widened. What? Then, a sound. A crack. Pain exploded through Gorvak's ribs. The force of the impact sent him staggering backward. The crowd gasped. The human stood exactly where Gorvak had been a moment ago, his fist still extended. He had moved past Gorvak's attack before it even landed. And then he had hit him. Hard. Gorvak's clawed hand instinctively went to his ribs. He felt something wrong beneath the thick armor of his scales. A fracture. Impossible. No one, not even the cybernetic warriors of the Dreth Consortium, had ever hit him hard enough to break anything. And this fragile human had done it with a single punch? Gorvak snarled, his rage boiling over. Enough of this. No more games. He would get this thing where it stood. He charged again, this time putting his full force into the attack. His energy flail crackled to life, glowing red-hot, whipping toward the human's head. His war blades slashed from two different angles, ensuring there was no escape. It didn't matter. The human moved through it like a ghost. Every strike missed by centimeters. Perfect evasion. The flail passed within inches of his face, burning the air, but not him. And then, he struck. A single hit to Gorvak's knee. The crack of bone echoed across the pit. Gorvak's leg buckled. He went down, his massive form crashing into the sand. The stadium fell silent. The laughter was gone. And for the first time in his life, Gorvak felt fear. The impact of Gorvak's collapse sent a tremor through the Colosseum floor, shaking the bones of the thousands of spectators who had once laughed at the human's arrival. The champion of Viekari's prime, the undefeated executioner, the monster who had slaughtered countless warriors, was on his knees. And the human had put him there with a single strike. Silence choked the air. In all the history of the pits, no challenger had ever done this to Gorvak. The massive reptilian warrior clutched his knee, his face twisted in pain. The thick armor-like scales that should have been impervious to blows were cracked, the joint beneath shattered. His other legs trembled as he struggled to regain his footing, but for the first time in his life, his body refused to obey him. And standing before him, calm and unshaken, was the human. The frail, unarmed, weak human. He had barely moved. His stance was still relaxed, his breathing even, as if he hadn't just brought down a monster 3 times his size. And that was what made the entire stadium uneasy. This wasn't luck. This wasn't some desperate attempt at survival. This human knew exactly what he was doing. Gorvak's furious growl broke the eerie silence. His 6 massive arms tightened around his weapons. Plasma axes, war blades, and the energy flail, his instruments of destruction, the tools he had used to slaughter warriors far deadlier than this pathetic creature. He had been playing with the human. That was his mistake. This time, he would not hold back. Gorvak roared, slamming one fist into the ground. I will rip your limbs from your body, filth. He exploded into motion, lunging forward on his remaining good leg, swinging his energy flail with the force of a collapsing star. The air around the weapon crackled with searing heat, burning everything in its path. If it connected, the human would be incinerated on impact. The strike missed. Again. But not because the human had stepped back. He had stepped forward. A blur of movement. In the fraction of a second that it took for the flail to descend, the human had closed the distance. Gorvak's reptilian eyes widened in horror. Then, a fist slammed into his ribcage with the force of a starship collision. Crack. A shockwave of pure impact rippled through his body. The pain was instant. Unbearable. A second blow followed, this time to his stomach. Gorvak felt his insides twist violently, his body betraying him as blood surged up his throat. He barely had time to register the agony before. Crack. A third punch. A direct hit to his sternum, right between his monstrous pectoral muscles. The force of the blow lifted him off the ground. For an instant, Gorvak was airborne. A 12-foot-tall beast, a warrior feared across the stars, helpless in midair. Then, the human moved again. With a single brutal motion, he gripped one of Gorvak's lower arms and twisted. The sound of bones snapping like dry wood echoed across the arena. Gorvak's scream was unlike anything the Colosseum had ever heard. It wasn't the cry of a warrior. It was the howl of a dying animal. The champion of the pits crashed back into the sand, writhing in agony, his shattered limb dangling uselessly at his side. His weapons lay scattered around him, forgotten. The crowd that had once roared with laughter was now silent. Thousands of eyes stared in shock at the scene before them. The human wasn't even winded. Not a single drop of sweat lined his forehead. His breathing was calm, controlled. And that was the moment they understood. This human was not prey. He was the predator. From the stands, the pit masters watched in stunned silence. These were the warlords who controlled the Colosseum, alien aristocrats who bathed in bloodsport, ruling over the gladiatorial pits like gods. They had seen countless battles. They had witnessed champions rise and fall. But they had never seen this. One of the pit masters, a towering Dreth cyborg with half of his body encased in gleaming metal, leaned forward, his robotic eye whirring as it zoomed in on the human. This? He muttered. This is impossible. Another pit master, a bloated Zakari insectoid, clicked its mandibles nervously. Gorvak is losing. The third, a Krovex warlord with glowing red implants embedded in his skull, growled in frustration. Then we intervene. He has humiliated our champion. He will die for it. A signal was given. And below, in the depths of the Colosseum, the gates of the pit rumbled open once more. The fight was no longer one-on-one. This would be an execution. The human's head tilted slightly as he heard the heavy metallic creak of the gates. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked amused. From the darkness beyond the gates, the reinforcements arrived. A squad of Dreth enforcers, their cybernetic bodies enhanced for war, emerged first. Their energy rifles hummed with power, their glowing eyes locked onto the human. Behind them, a pair of Zorkan warriors, each rivaling Gorvak in size, brandished massive shock mauls, their footsteps shaking the ground. More fighters poured in, Zakari blade dancers, Krovex berserkers, even a Gorthal executioner, a nightmare of blackened armor and energy-forged weapons. Together, they formed a wall of death, surrounding the human from all sides. The announcer barely had time to react before the pit master's command came through the speakers. The trial continues. Kill him. The human finally smiled. It wasn't the grin of a man facing death. It was the smile of a hunter who had just found his prey. Good, he murmured, cracking his knuckles. Now it's a real fight. The warriors attacked. The slaughter began. In the blink of an eye, the human moved. A Dreth enforcer's rifle was raised, too slow. The human was already in front of him. One punch. The force of the blow ripped the enforcer's head from his shoulders, sending it flying into the crowd. The Zorkan warriors swung their shock mauls. The human sidestepped, barely an inch between him and death. Then, before they could react, his fist drove into one warrior's throat, crushing his windpipe. The other barely had time to blink before his kneecap was obliterated. He collapsed, screaming. The Zakari blade dancers struck next, their razor-sharp limbs slicing toward him at blinding speed. The human weaved through their attacks like a shadow. Then, he ripped one of their arms off. The insectoid warrior shrieked as its own blade impaled its chest. Blood sprayed the sand. Bodies fell. The human kept moving, tearing through them like a force of nature. The crowd, once baying for his death, now watched in stunned horror. The pit was no longer an arena. It was a massacre. And at the center of it all, the human stood untouched. The bloodshed had only just begun. The sand was no longer golden. It was red, soaked in blood, littered with corpses. A battlefield of broken bodies and shattered bones lay sprawled across the arena floor. And the human? He stood among the slaughter, unscathed. His bare fists dripped with alien gore, his expression unreadable, almost bored, as if none of this had been a challenge. The once mighty Dreth enforcers? Dead. Their cybernetic skulls caved in, their glowing visors flickering like dying embers. The Zorkan warriors? Slaughtered. Their enormous bodies lay in pieces, the shock mauls they once wielded now silent in the dirt. The Zakari blade dancers? Torn apart. Their razor limbs, so deadly, so fast, useless against an opponent who moved like a ghost. Even the towering Gorthal executioner, a nightmare in black armor, lay crumpled in the sand, his spine snapped like brittle wood. It had taken only minutes. An entire squad of the Colosseum's elite warriors, handpicked to execute the human, had been annihilated instead. The crowd, thousands of aliens who had once howled with laughter, were silent. This was not entertainment. This was war. Above the carnage, in the high towers of the arena, the pit masters watched in stunned horror. They had ruled the Colosseum for centuries, orchestrating bloodsport for their amusement. They had seen monsters and champions, creatures born and bred for war. But they had never seen this. The Dreth cyborg pit master clenched his metal fist, his red robotic eyes scanning the human in disbelief. "Here's a weapon. That's not a man, it's a death machine in human skin." The insectoid Zakari pit master's mandibles clattered nervously. "Gorvak is down. The executioner is down. We sent an entire squad after him, and he's still moving." The Krovex warlord pit master's rage boiled over. "Then we unleash everything. No more warriors. No more playthings. We end this now." He slammed a fist against the control panel, activating the Colosseum's final defense. The gates of the arena rumbled open once more. This time, it wasn't warriors. It wasn't gladiators. It was the beasts. A deafening roar shook the entire Colosseum. From the darkness of the tunnels, they emerged. First came the Corvash Devourer, a three-headed monstrosity with obsidian black armor plating and fangs the size of swords. Its multiple eyes burned with hunger, its massive claws scraping against the ground. Behind it, a Voxrai war beast lumbered forward, a towering brute of muscle and bone, its arms covered in searing plasma chains that melted the sand beneath it. And finally, the Nixian Reaper, the death hound of the stars, an invisible killer, a predator that phased in and out of reality, leaving only bleeding corpses in its wake. These were not gladiators. These were creatures that had wiped out entire armies. And now? They were being unleashed on a single man. The Colosseum erupted in cheers. Not because they wanted to see the human win. Because they were convinced, this was finally the end. No one could stand against the beasts. No one could survive this. The human tilted his head, watching them approach. And then, for the first time, he laughed. The Corvash Devourer struck first. It lunged forward, all three of its massive heads snapping at once, its jaws wide enough to swallow a speeder tank whole. The air shook with the force of its attack. But the human? He was already gone. A blur of motion, he moved faster than the eye could track, weaving through the beast's attacks with inhuman precision. 1 second he was there. The next, he was beneath the monster. Crack! A single, perfectly aimed uppercut shattered the Devourer's jaw, sending one of its heads snapping backward with a sickening crunch. The beast stumbled, roaring in agony. The human moved again. One strike. The Devourer's second head exploded into gore, crushed by the force of a punch that defied reality. The crowd screamed. The final head snapped forward, desperate to kill this impossible foe. But it was too late. The human gripped the beast's lower jaw with both hands, and ripped it clean off. A fountain of alien blood erupted from the monster's throat. The Corvash Devourer, the destroyer of civilizations, collapsed into the sand, dead. The crowd, silent once more. The Voxrai war beast let out an ear-splitting roar, its plasma chains crackling with lethal energy as it charged. The human ran toward it. Not away, toward it. The war beast swung. A wall of searing plasma descended toward the human, hot enough to melt reinforced starship hulls. And yet, the human dodged. A blur of motion, he slid under the chains, closing the distance in an instant. And then, his fist drove into the war beast's ribs. Boom. The impact was so powerful, it sent shockwaves through the arena. The war beast lurched, its eyes going wide in shock. Then, a second punch. Then a third. Then a fourth. Each strike landed with the force of a railgun blast, caving in armor, shattering bones, rupturing organs. And then, one final blow. The warbeast's entire chest cavity collapsed inward. It hit the ground like a falling mountain. Dead. The human exhaled slowly. One monster left. The Nixian Reaper phased into existence, its form flickering in and out of reality like a nightmare given flesh. The predator of the void, a creature that no warrior had ever bested. It lunged. The human didn't move. The Reaper flickered again, teleporting behind him, moving faster than any eye could follow. And yet, the human was already there. He had anticipated it. Read its movement before it even moved. His hand shot out, catching the Reaper's throat mid-teleport. The beast's eyes went wide. The human tightened his grip. For a moment, the monster struggled, then the human's hand snapped shut like a vice. Crack! The Reaper went limp. Its body fell to the sand. Lifeless. The final beast, defeated. The Colosseum was silent. No cheers. No screams. Just pure, unfiltered horror. A single man had walked into the arena. And now, hundreds were dead. The human looked up at the stands, his eyes locking onto the pit masters. His voice, calm, steady, cut through the silence like a blade. Send me your next challenger. There was no next challenger. Because now, everyone knew. The real monster was human. The Colosseum had never known silence like this. Not when the galactic warlord Tregroth took the heads of 5 rival kings in a single duel. Not when the titan beasts of Vexor Prime trampled 100 gladiators into paste. Not when the legendary Pyron Blade ripped through an entire army with his plasma sword. Nothing compared to this. Tens of thousands of alien spectators, warriors, nobles, crime lords, and warlords, sat frozen, staring at the blood-soaked humans standing amidst the bodies of their so-called champions. No weapons. No armor. No enhancements. And yet, he had won. No. He had butchered them. The only sound in the entire Colosseum was the slow, deliberate crunch of his boots against the blood-stained sand as he walked toward the center of the arena. Above, in the towering viewing box, the pit masters were panicking. He is a demon, the insectoid Zakari master stammered, his mandibles clicking erratically. Nothing mortal fights like this. The Krovex warlord slammed his fist into the metal railing, cracking it in half. We are the rulers of this Colosseum. We do not bow to a single man. Kill him. Send in every gladiator, every war beast. Turn this entire pit into his grave. The Dreth cyborg's red eye flickered, scanning the human with something close to fear. No. Not just the gladiators. Activate the arena defenses. All of them. Beneath the sand, the arena woke up. Gears churned. Steel barriers rose from the ground, forming a massive kill box around the human. Walls of plasma ignited, sealing him inside. High above, the battle turrets emerged from hidden compartments, their multi-barreled cannons locking on. And from the reinforced gates, the last wave arrived. Not warriors. Not gladiators. Drones. Hundreds of autonomous killing machines, forged in the forges of the war factories, designed for a single purpose, annihilation. They hovered above the sand, red targeting optics flickering to life. The moment the pit master gave the signal, the entire Colosseum would erupt in a storm of gunfire, plasma, and shrapnel. The pit master raised his hand. The human cracked his neck. The pit master dropped his hand. Hell was unleashed. 1,000 bullets tore through the air, an unrelenting barrage of plasma bolts, hypersonic rounds, and energy beams. The arena became a war zone. The sand beneath the human's feet exploded, turning into molten glass from the sheer intensity of the firepower. The force of the onslaught was enough to vaporize most creatures on impact. But the human? He was already moving. Too fast. Too precise. Too lethal. He darted between the hail of fire, weaving through death as if he could see the bullets before they were even fired. He leapt onto the nearest drone, his bare hands gripping its metal shell. With a single twist, he ripped its rotary cannon from its body, turning the weapon on its own allies. A storm of destruction erupted. Plasma bolts and high-caliber slugs tore through the drones, reducing them to falling wreckage. The human didn't stop. He vaulted from one machine to the next, tearing them apart with inhuman strength, hijacking their weapons, using their own firepower against them. Turrets rained death from above. But the human was already there. A single, impossibly high jump, he reached the nearest turret, gripping its barrel with both hands. And ripped it out of its housing. Sparks and flames burst from the ceiling as he turned the massive gun downward, firing into the remaining drones. Explosions erupted across the arena. Metal husks crashed into the sand, smoke rising into the sky. Within minutes, every last drone, every turret, every defense system, was destroyed. The entire Colosseum trembled. The pit masters, once so confident in their power, now looked down at the only thing left standing. A single human. Breathing steady. Eyes locked onto them. And then, he started walking toward the viewing box. Panic exploded in the pit master's chamber. His coming, one of them screeched. Seal the doors. Activate the palace guard. Deploy the elite sentinels. Guards, dozens of them, poured into the room, weapons raised. The warlord pit master snarled, slamming his fist on the emergency comms. I want the planetary defense force mobilized. The moment he leaves the Colosseum, burn him off the face of the planet, ****. The insectoid pit master's mandibles trembled. You think he'll wait for that? Because below them, the human had already reached the gates. He placed a single hand against the massive steel doors. The same doors that could withstand orbital bombardment. And then, he pushed. The gates exploded inward. Metal and stone shattered, the force of his attack ripping the chamber apart. The guards barely had time to react before he was among them. And then, the slaughter began. He was a hurricane of destruction. A whirlwind of death. The first guard raised his plasma rifle. The human crushed his skull with a single strike. The second lunged with a shock spear. The human twisted it out of his hands and impaled him instead. The rest opened fire. But they might as well have been shooting at a god. He ripped through them, moving too fast, hitting too hard, a force beyond their comprehension. Limbs shattered. Armor cracked like glass. Blood sprayed across the chamber like rain. In less than 60 seconds, all of them were dead. Only the pit masters remained. Trapped. Helpless. The human stepped forward, casually wiping the blood from his knuckles. "Please," the insectoid master begged, his voice barely a whisper. "We can offer you anything. Wealth. Power. A throne in the Empire." The human stared at him. And then, he grabbed the alien's skull and crushed it in his hand. The warlord pit master roared in defiance, drawing his plasma axe. The human tore his arm from his body and beat him to death with it. The final pit master, the Dreth cyborg, tried to activate an emergency shield. The human put his fist through his chest before he could finish pressing the button. The Colosseum burned. The once mighty rulers lay dead at his feet. Outside, the city beyond the arena was in chaos. The planetary forces were mobilizing. Gunships filled the sky. Armored walkers marched toward the Colosseum, cannons primed. And in the center of it all, the human stood alone. Surrounded. Outnumbered. And yet, he smiled. Because the battle was just beginning. The human stood in the center of the burning Colosseum, his body splattered with the blood of aliens who had thought him weak. Above, warships loomed. Gunships circled like vultures. The planetary defense force, thousands strong, had mobilized. The warlords, pit masters, and crime lords who ruled this world had never imagined their might would be tested by one man. Yet here he was. Alone. Unarmed. And utterly unafraid. The planetary governor's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, fury barely contained. "You insignificant worm. You are outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. This is your last chance, surrender." The human looked up at the distant balcony where the governor stood. The bloated alien, clad in ceremonial armor, clutched the railings, his beady eyes wide with rage. The human grinned. "Make me." The governor's face contorted with fury. He turned to his commanders. "Kill him. Kill him now. The onslaught begins." The sky screamed as gunships unleashed a storm of plasma fire, missiles, and railgun rounds. The entire arena erupted. Walls collapsed. Sand and blood turned to molten glass. The impact of the blast sent shockwaves through the city itself, toppling nearby buildings. Nothing could survive such destruction. Nothing mortal. And yet, as the dust settled, as the flames roared, the human walked out of the inferno. His body was smoking, his skin blackened in places, but he was alive. And he was angry. A gunship pilot, watching through his targeting visor, muttered in disbelief. "That's not possible." The human launched himself into the air. He shouldn't have been able to. Not without cybernetics. Not without augmentation. But he did. He landed on the nearest gunship, his boots denting the reinforced plating. Before the crew could react, he drove his fists through the cockpit glass. The pilot screamed as the human ripped him out, tossing him into the flames below. Then, gripping the flight controls with one hand, the human yanked the ship upward, forcing it to spin wildly. The surrounding gunships tried to adjust. But it was too late. The human slammed the stolen ship into them. Explosions lit up the sky. Twisted metal and burning debris rained onto the city. The planetary governor watched in horror as one man, destroyed his entire attack squadron with his bare hands. This is a nightmare," he whispered. But the nightmare was just beginning. The city burns. The human leapt from the wreckage of the last gunship, landing atop a battle tank. The armored walkers on the streets locked onto him, plasma cannons charging. He moved first. Tearing open the hatch, he ripped the pilot out and threw him so hard he shattered the stone walls of a nearby building. Then he took control. A single pull of the trigger. And the streets erupted in fire. The tank's plasma cannon tore through entire squadrons of infantry. Gun emplacements, armored vehicles, mechs, none of them could withstand the storm. Soldiers fled in terror. Officers screamed into their comms, "Retreat! Retreat! We can't stop him." The governor was now visibly shaking. This is madness. One man cannot do this. He cannot win. But deep down, he knew. It was already over. The human leapt from the tank, rolling onto the cracked pavement. He was coming. For the palace. for the governor himself. The final stand. The palace gates, *** 10 meters thick, reinforced with Imperium steel, *** were closed. Behind them, the last of the governor's forces had gathered. Shock troops. Elite enforcers. Cybernetic warlords. The strongest warriors on the planet. They were the last line of defense. The gates shuddered as the human approached. One of the enforcers whispered, "His coming." A second later, the gates exploded inward. The human was inside. The last defenders opened fire. Their weapons lit up the darkness, filling the air with beams of energy, Gauss rounds, ion blasts. None of it mattered. The human moved like death incarnate. One by one, he tore through the defenders. A shock trooper raised his blade, the human snapped his arm like a twig and buried his own weapon into his chest. An elite guard lunged with cybernetic speed, the human caught him midair and crushed his skull with a single punch. A warlord, clad in heavy armor, roared, "You die here, human." The human ripped his helmet off and caved his head in with his bare hands. The governor could only watch in horror as his last forces fell. The human walked up the final steps. His footsteps echoed. He reached the governor's throne room. The alien, trembling, fell to his knees. Please," he whispered. You've won. Take the planet. Take the empire. Just, let me live." The human looked down at him. "I don't want your empire." The governor blinked. Then, what do you want?" The human's voice was cold. "Justice." Then he grabbed the governor's skull. And crushed it. The legend begins. The planet lay in ruins. The Colosseum, destroyed. The ruling warlords, slaughtered. The planetary governor, dead. And one man stood at the center of it all. The transmission of his battle had spread across the entire galactic network. Millions had watched. They had seen what happened when you underestimated a human. The other warlords of the galaxy now whispered his name. The Empire's leaders feared him. And on 1,000 planets, the slaves, the broken, the oppressed, they cheered. Because for the first time, they had seen the truth. One man can change everything. And as the human stood amidst the ruins, surrounded by the burning wreckage of an empire, he smiled. Because this was only the beginning.